The World Order, Lessons from the Gulf. Our speaker this evening is Professor Burns Weston from the University of Iowa. He teaches law there, and although originally he's from the East Coast, by looking at the dates on his vita, it appears that he is approaching a quarter of a century in this state now. He is very interested in international law and has been instrumental not only in Iowa in developing concerns for this area, but he has produced a major book that I was noticing in reading a curriculum guide the other day that is used in many of the major university courses on international law and world order studies throughout the United States. This was published in 1984. It's Toward Nuclear Disarmament and Global Security, A Search for Alternatives. More recently, another book has come out in 1990, Alternative Security, Living Without Nuclear Deterrence. Professor Weston has his Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from Yale, although he began, as I noticed, in music at Oberlin, which is intriguing. And that may be why when his daughter suggested the following lead into this book, he accepted so readily. The quote is, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds," from Bob Marley, the Redemption Song. Because Burns Weston is more than just an academic. He carries his expertise out to the world in a variety of ways. One of the ways is coming to Ames, Iowa, to speak to us tonight about the global order, the new global order, question mark, lessons from the Gulf. Burns Weston.
Can you hear? Because when I was sitting down there, it was very hard to hear. If I stand back from the mic, does that help? Or is it still fuzzy? Okay. If some of you would like to move up closer to the front and feel more intimate, that's fine, if you'd like to do that. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. What I want to do tonight is to address the question of this so-called New World Order that President Bush has been talking about, not so much from the standpoint of trying to predict what he means, trying to outline the contours of that order as it might unfold, but rather to look upon the last roughly 6 months of decision-making that led up to and ultimately involved us in hostilities in the Persian Gulf, to see whether through the process of decision that was what marked these last 6 months so dramatically, whether there's something in that we can draw by way of lesson to indicate what this future New World Order is supposed to be all about. I'll try to avoid as best I can some of the technical legal aspects of it, although those are important, and address those issues which, for an audience not trained in the law, as I assume most of you are not, will be easier to understand. But I do want to begin with a quotation from a new book by a colleague of mine who is a professor of international law at NYU and also the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, on the board of editors of which I sit, because he wrote a book recently entitled The Power of Legitimacy Among Nations. And in this book, he tried to define the concept of legitimacy as it applies to rules and institutions applicable among states in the global community. And I think it's important to have this by way of background so that we can understand the significance of what, in fact, has happened in the last roughly 6 months. Bear with me, it's a rather convoluted statement, and then I'll try to translate it for you. Legitimacy, he writes, is a property of a rule or rule-making institution which itself exerts a pull toward compliance on those addressed normatively because those addressed believe that the rule or institution has come into being and operates in accordance with generally accepted principles of right process. Now, translated, what that all boils down to saying is that you might have a rule that might be perfectly lawful in a technical sense, but it might not be legitimate because it might not have emanated from an authority or through a process that would be considered acceptable as to how one creates those rules and institutions. In other words, we all know when something is illegitimate because we know that the process by which we got from A to B was somehow wrong. It didn't comport with generally accepted notions of right process. Now, in authorizing the use of force against Iraq via Resolution 678 of November 29 of this last year, which was the one, you'll recall, that had the deadline of January 15 and had the statement in it about using all necessary means to force Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. In authorizing the use of force in that resolution, in my judgment, the UN Security Council flirted precariously with generally accepted principles of right process, eschewing direct UN responsibility and accountability for the consequences of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and also a subsequent occupation, in favor of a delegated and essentially unilateralist determination and orchestration of world policy, coordinated and controlled basically by the United States. In my view, this decision and the process by which it was reached set a dubious precedent both for the United Nations as it obtains today and for the New World Order President Bush claims for tomorrow. Now, this is not to say that Iraq did not deserve to be called to legal account, or that the Security Council lacked the legal competence to delegate the use of force in this instance, or even, for that matter, that its license to wage war was necessarily illegitimate in Professor Frank's rather limited qualified sense of legitimacy, when he adds the adjectives generally accepted principles of right process. That qualifies it enormously. On the contrary, Iraq committed international crimes of a Nuremberg type. The Security Council, at least in practice, is the final arbiter of its own authority, the International Court of Justice notwithstanding. And though it's much in need of restructuring to rectify historic anachronisms, especially relative to UN operations in the Third World, the Security Council is likewise its own court of last resort when it comes to defining its right process under the United Nations Charter. But it is to say that the overall process of decision that marked the Security Council's determination to authorize war, involving, in my view, a discernible thirst for confrontation, and therefore raising, in my judgment, exceedingly troublesome questions about the extent to which the UN was true to its own originally intended charter, fell alarmingly short of what minimally should have been required when fundamental community policies and values are at stake, as indeed they were in the Persian Gulf. Contrary to the popular wisdom of self-congratulatory post-war euphoria in which we are currently basking, and that has been dominant for the last month or so, the Resolution 678 decision process was not legitimate, in my view, at least not legitimate in an aspirational sense, and therefore not laudable and certainly not comforting as a preview, if it may be called that, of the New World Order that we are told lies in store. And this is seen in four principal ways, and I want to run you through these so you get a sense of what I'm trying to say. It's seen first in what I call the indeterminacy of Resolution 678's legal authority. Secondly, in the great power pressure diplomacy that marked its adoption. Thirdly, in its wholly unrestricted character. And lastly, in the Council's hasty retreat from nonviolent sanctioning alternatives that would have been permissible under it. Now let me try to take each one of these. And first, the so-called indeterminate legal authority for Resolution 678. And this is the most technical point, and I will not dwell long on it, but let me summarize it by saying this: that after you have parsed the provisions of the United Nations Charter, the key provisions of the Charter, I'm referring in particular to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is that part of the UN Charter that provides for the peacekeeping, if you will, structure of the UN under the aegis of the Security Council. After you've gone through those provisions, analyzed the text, after you've looked at their legislative history, as it were, as to how they got drafted, after you look at the precedent that has been set since 1945 in San Francisco, the way they've been interpreted, what you discover is that there is neither an explicit nor even a clearly implicit authorization revealed for what the UN Security Council did in the Persian Gulf. That gives me pause. And when I discovered this, I decided, well, maybe I should call up the legal advisor's office of the State Department, because they had a major hand in drafting this particular resolution. And maybe they know something I don't know. Maybe they're hiding something that I haven't been able to detect. So I and a group of students at various times would periodically call up various members of the legal advisor's office to the State Department, which is in effect the blue ribbon legal panel for the State Department. Conflicting answers, runarounds, we won't tell yous, all kinds of responses like that, but nobody came out and said, well, the authority is based on X. Nobody would say. That gave me pause. And it gives me a lot of pause when, as in this instance, the stakes were quite literally a matter of life and death, and potentially, as we look back to November 29, at least from that perspective, on a very grand scale indeed. Now, some of you may be asking in this connection, well, what about Korea? Didn't we pull it all together in Korea? Didn't the Security Council create a precedent for us there? Well, at first blush, the answer to that is yes. It seems like there was a precedent that quite possibly was what the Security Council was following in this instance. The problem is that both on a basis of an analysis of Article 39 of the Charter, which is what was the provision that authorized the Korean police action, and on the basis of conversations with some of these people in the legal advisor's office, plus, I can assure you, a great deal of digging around in UN records and trying to trace the whole hidden history of the Korean War. This particular action wasn't based upon the Korean episode. And well, it might not have been, for some very good reasons. Because even if it is factually familiar in character it's a shaky precedent at best. By virtue of President Truman having deployed air and sea forces before military sanctions had been authorized by the Security Council in the case of Korea, the Council had to vote sanctions or put itself in the position of opposing action taken by the United States. And for governments independently and collectively dependent on American largesse, an American fait accompli strategy assured quick and essentially quiet acquiescence on the part of the United Nations and its Security Council in the case of Korea, and accordingly, so-called United Nations forces were made subject to General MacArthur without in any way General MacArthur being made subject to the United Nations. In fact, President Truman made what I regard as one of the great classical Freudian slips of diplomatic history, when at the time, having already sent U.S. troops and trying to get the United Nations flag to cover over this particular action, he went on the radio. We didn't have television broadcasts in those days. He went on the radio and he announced to the American people, "I am today sending United Stations troops to Korea." That's how confused that precedent was. From the standpoint today in the Persian Gulf of a United States government that was eager to optimize its chances for multilateral cooperation, it would be, I think, an unlikely precedent, certainly not one that it would want to call attention to, especially when, just 3 weeks earlier, on November 8th, President Bush had unilaterally already begun to amass an offensive force of some 500,000 military personnel. So, with Resolution 678, evidencing no explicit or clearly implicit authorization in the text of the Charter or in its legislative history or in pertinent state practice, one is left to conclude that the Security Council created an entirely new precedent, whole cloth, out of some assumed penumbra of powers available to the Council under the Charter, a so-called Article 41.5 authorization, as some people have referred to it. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that kind of development. It's analogous, as a matter of fact, to the judicially developed penumbra of powers that are available to the President in the exercise of foreign relations powers under the U.S. Constitution. And actually, from a perspective that welcomes strengthened UN policing opportunities and capabilities, including a Security Council that's positioned to act quickly and effectively, it may, this precedent, if wisely fine-tuned, prove salutary over the long run. But when human life and other fundamental values are being put greatly and severely at risk, as surely they were when Resolution 678 was adopted, it seems to me not inappropriate to insist upon unambiguously articulated war-making authority. We would never tolerate such ambiguity in our own legal system. That the Security Council did not choose that course bespeaks, in my view, either extreme laxity or negligence, or more likely, a Council majority motivated more by the special geostrategic interests of Resolution 678's principal drafters, namely the United Kingdom and the United States, than it was by a world-constituted instrument created in important part, and I quote here from the preamble of the Charter, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. I submit a new world order deserves better. Let me turn now to how all this came about. what I refer to as the great power pressure diplomacy behind Resolution 678. This is a little less technical, a little more understandable, perhaps. In a televised announcement 2 days after Resolution 678 was adopted, the government of Iraq denounced the resolution on the grounds that the United States had succeeded in turning the Security Council into, and I quote, a tool of American hegemony, a theater for dirty deals. This being a reference to Resolution 678 having been drafted in large part by U.S. personnel, and as well to the not inconsiderable bargaining that characterized the intense and successful U.S. effort to assure a favorable vote. Now, considering the source of the allegations, you might be understandably disinclined to take them very seriously, and instead to endorse the viewpoint that was expressed in the Washington Post in an editorial the day after Resolution 678 was adopted, and I quote, to wit, that the bargaining fell well, within accepted norms, and that the objective gained was special. Translate that to mean good. Maybe so. Similar self-interest tactics characterized the U.S. effort to obtain multilateral support for the action in Korea. But if Washington is serious about a new world order that shows a decent respect for all the purposes and principles for which the United Nations stands, it desirably should have thought further about the tactics it employed. To ensure the votes of the Latin American and African delegations, the United States promised long-sought financial help and attention. To win reliable Soviet support, the U.S. agreed to keep Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia out of the November 1990 Paris Peace Conference, and additionally pledged to get Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to provide Moscow, as they subsequently did, with hard currency that Moscow desperately needs to catch up on overdue payments to commercial creditors. And to secure voluntary Chinese abstention, I put the word voluntary in quotes, to secure voluntary Chinese abstention in lieu of a threatened Chinese veto of Resolution 678, the U.S., disregarding at the time a current crackdown on political dissidents, agreed to lift trade sanctions that had been in place since the Tiananmen Square massacre of pro-democracy protesters, agreed to support a $114.3 million loan to China from the World Bank, and to promise a long-sought Washington visit by the Chinese foreign minister, subsequently realized, and the resumption of normal diplomatic intercourse between the two countries. And not to be overlooked either is the, we'll call it a reward with a question mark, that was reportedly communicated to Yemen as a result of its opposition and negative vote, namely a cutoff of Washington's $70 million in annual aid. Now, it can be argued, of course, that this kind of bargaining is characteristic of the log rolling that typifies legislative process in our national arenas. And so some of it was, I suspect. Promising economic rewards to Latin American, African, and Soviet delegations, for example, seems of this genre to me. But when the influence peddling involves a diminution or a repudiation of purposes and principles for which the United Nations stands, for example, the promotion of human rights, or when it bespeaks punishment for votes conscientiously cast, and thereby a conscious subversion of right process, then I submit one must demur on grounds of what in French law is referred to as excès de pouvoir, excess of power, excess abuse of power. The solicitous treatment accorded the Soviet Union relative to the Baltic republics and to China, relative to its pro-democracy dissidents, just like that rather blind-eye obsequiousness that the United States extended to Hafez al-Assad's terrorist Syria, to ensure its participation in the subsequently organized U.S.-led military coalition fall into this class, in my judgment, as does also the retribution directed against Yemen. From a perspective that champions a world public order of human dignity, in which values are shaped and shared more by persuasion than by coercion, it's not enough merely to lament, as some of my colleagues have done, the bitter irony of having to embrace the butchers of Tiananmen and the butcher of Hama in order to repel the butcher of Baghdad, or to conclude that when using the UN as a policy instrument, the United States, and I quote from a colleague, will have no choice but to secure the cooperation of others by trading in whatever is the coin of exchange of the moment. Or that international law has no choice, as one of my colleagues says, but to be realistic. We do have a choice. We had one right up to January 15th, to reject war and find other realistic ways to settle disputes among nations. And so the process by which Security Council Resolution 678 was won, while perhaps legally correct in the technical sense, confirms how absolutely complete the power of the United States had become relative to the UN's policing mechanism in the absence of Cold War opposition. It was part of the larger imprint of great power exhortation and cajolery, including the controversial forgiveness extended to Egypt's debts, and the later, even more controversial deference shown to Syria's control of northern Lebanon, that after August 2nd, but especially after November 8th, when President Bush unilaterally ordered the doubling of U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf, so indelibly marked what must be described as a relentless U.S. drive, along with Great Britain, to force Saddam Hussein's hand by force if necessary. It was part of the larger context of ferocious self-interest among all the parties that demands to be taken into account when we assess the true precedential virtue, and not merely the formal legality and legitimacy of a U.S.-dominated armada relative to authentic power sharing in a much heralded new era of multilateral accountability and responsibility. Now, to appreciate fully the extent to which, in this crisis, U.S. influence over UN decision-making, however technically lawful and legitimate, did in fact marginalize the United Nations as a meaningful player in international peacemaking, it's important to acknowledge my third point, the essentially unrestricted authorization given to the UN members in Resolution 678. By authorizing the use of all necessary means to uphold and implement Security Council Resolution 660 and all subsequent relevant resolutions, that's a quotation from Resolution 678, that resolution did appear to have restricted the use of force and other means to the liberation of Kuwait. But when you look at the authorization further, where it refers to restoring international peace and security in the area, and you see that in combination with the ambiguous language in all the cognate resolutions that were adopted by the Security Council, some 11 others, well, it's a field day for lawyers. It led obvious room for interpretation and operational maneuver. But the unrestricted character of Resolution 678 does not just stop at that point. In addition to leaving the precise source of its authority unstated, as I noted already, the resolution neglected, for example, to restrict the destructive weaponry or the means of warfare that could be used and relied upon to get rid of Saddam Hussein and get him out of Kuwait. And, even worse, did not require any accounting to or guidance from the Security Council, the Military Staff Committee provided for in the UN Charter, or any other UN institution that might have been appropriate. It also set no time limits whatsoever on the use of all necessary means. In other words, in Resolution 678, the Security Council gave the United Nations membership a blank check to do whatever they wanted vis-à-vis Iraq after January 15, including the waging of war on whatever terms and in whatever ways they might choose. This license was, of course, precisely what the U.S.-led coalition's confrontational politics demanded it, making it politically congenial to forego exclusive reliance on the economic sanctions that had been in place and to disregard other nonviolent options that could have assisted them. But it was a perverse license, one would think, considering that the United Nations was established preeminently, as proclaimed in the preamble of its own charter, and I quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. As was very keenly observed in my judgment the day after the resolution's vote by the ambassador from Yemen, whose acuity, I should hasten to add, ought not to be discounted because of his political loyalties, the resolution was, and I quote, so broad and vague that it would allow nations to use the UN flag to make war independently. A classic case, he said, of authority without accountability. And was not Ambassador Al-Ashtal right? The consequences of the Security Council's abdication of responsibility, and that's what I think you can call it, are there for all of us to see. The UN virtually disappeared from the diplomatic scene, and Secretary General Perez de Cuellar was relegated to the role of file clerk and messenger boy, essentially to operate within the Bush administration's guidelines. Given no more than 1 hour's notice of Washington's decision to go to war, and thereafter informed of the war's progress only after action occurred. Indeed, once the hostilities began, for those of you who had your eyes glued to CNN, presidential news conferences, military news briefings didn't even bother to maintain even the pretense of United Nations presence or involvement, except in the most peripheral ways. The very words United Nations were scarcely heard after January 16th, or at least not until after the ceasefire and the discovery of near-apocalyptic devastation, as the UN mission described it, to Iraq's civilian infrastructure at the hands of the US-led coalition. Surely this is not what the UN founders and the charter drafters had in mind. Surely they must have thought, in a crisis of the magnitude and complexity of this one, that the Security Council would have been meeting around the clock, and that the Secretary General would have been working feverishly to produce a peaceful diplomatic solution, even and perhaps especially after the guns of January had gone off. But, except for some belated expression of Soviet concern toward the end of the fighting, no one, certainly no one in or at the United Nations was able or willing to challenge the United States-led coalition relative to the scope and the ultimate purposes of its military campaign. The unrestricted character of Resolution 678 may have been legal and legitimate in a technical sense, but from a perspective that values UN autonomy and authentic progress toward multilateral responsibility relative to issues of world peace and security, especially the actual waging of war, where people get killed, surely it cannot be said to have been laudable or legitimate in the aspirational sense. The UN itself, and not just the promise of UN collective security as it's long been understood, was made to stand on its head. Now, this paradoxical circumstance was substantially the consequence, of course, of the antiquated, anachronistic composition of the Security Council itself. The failure so far to ensure more equitable third world representation among the Council's permanent members in the name of, say, Algeria or Brazil or India or Indonesia or Nigeria, plus the absence among the permanent members of economically powerful Germany and Japan, who probably have more claim to being a permanent member than France or Great Britain these days, raise fundamental questions about the determination and orchestration, not to mention the essential morality of the UN's peace and security operations. A colleague of mine put it this way: the system of world order that the Security Council evokes, and I quote, continues to depend centrally on the United States. Primarily, however, the paradox that we see here was the consequence of an economically and militarily powerful United States, thus centrally positioned with the support of an enthusiastic junior partner in the name of Great Britain, that was tenaciously intent upon pressing the military option to the virtual disregard of any alternative world order strategy. All of the U.S. activity, including the pressure diplomacy that influenced the drafting of Resolution 678, appears to have been shaped by this confrontational design. It's true that stalwart independence and resolve on the part of countries like China or the Soviet Union could have made it otherwise. The veto power exists to guard against great power stampedes, among other things. But in view of China's and the Soviet Union's enormous needs for Western largesse and goodwill at this particular historical time, that kind of independence and resolve, irrespective of the merits of a counter-design, is plainly naive to expect. The Nation magazine ruefully editorialized this in the following way. It said, "We should do all we can to strengthen the UN as an instrument for the peaceful settlement of world disputes, but let us not delude ourselves. The old socialist bloc is irrevocably broken, and the ever-promising non-aligned group is practically non-functional now that there's only one world power." A world organization that is supposed to be dedicated first and foremost to the peaceful settlement of international disputes must at this time pin its hopes for less confrontational world order strategy upon the enlightened leadership of its most powerful members and their citizenries. A leadership that thinks long and that thinks hard about the true costs of war and about the enormous complexities of waging peace once war has been unleashed, as now we are again bearing witness. It's the fourth element in my theme here, in my scenario, though, that really troubles me the most. And I refer to the hasty rejection of the economic sanctions and the virtual disregard of all the other potential nonviolent options that might have been exercised. Many have commented critically on the prematurity of President Bush's decision to give up on the economic sanctions that had been imposed by the Security Council in favor of the military option, which was first initiated by the President's unilateral offensive deployment decision of November 8th, and that was later implicitly authorized in Resolution 678. Many have criticized this. Some critics have pointed out that the United States has been extremely patient with UN sanctions imposed against South Africa. And notwithstanding that over time, the international crimes committed by Pretoria have matched, even exceeded, those committed by Baghdad. And still others have noted that patience mixed with economic sanctions had its rewards in bringing home alive and without major warfare the unlawfully seized and detained American embassy hostages in Tehran in the late 1970s. As you might suspect, I agree with those who were critical of the President's decision, and not just because it was rendered a scandalously short 2 days after the November elections immediately preceding which the president had been urging the American people to practice patience and stay the course. The Iraqi sanctions were reliably reported to have been having an increasingly useful bite. They appeared to have commanded broad and politically salient support, even in the face of widespread knowledge that they would not likely produce decisive results for at least a year. Such card-carrying communists as former Secretary of Energy and of the Defense Schlesinger, former Chair of Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Crowe, former existing CIA Director Mr. Webster, all these people were saying this, former Secretary of the Navy Lehman. And while no one could claim with certainty that the sanctions alone would ultimately have succeeded to the fullest extent, I underscore the word alone, the military alternatives at the time, and it's important to carry ourselves back to that time because that's the basis upon which decisions were made. The military alternatives at the time were well understood to risk major death and destruction on an increasingly widening basis, staggering economic costs and dislocations, large-scale environmental harm, and the possible enmity of the peoples of the Arab and Islamic worlds for years, perhaps decades to come, threatening, as Newsweek put it, freelance terrorism against Western and particularly American persons and institutions everywhere. It is, I think, exceedingly troublesome that none of these and related arguments were able to persuade President Bush to step back from the precipice of military confrontation long enough to give the economic sanctions at least a chance to succeed. The perceptual reality, and that's the important point, the perceptual reality at the time of decision was one of extreme negative risk. And the fact that some of the projected harms did not materialize or have yet to come about does not detract from that truth. As it happens, of course, many of the projected harms have taken place, including unprecedented and continuing damage to the Kuwaiti and surrounding natural environment, the rape and pillage of the Kuwaiti people and their property, the near-apocalyptic destruction of Iraq's civilian infrastructure, and not least, the killing and the maiming of an estimated hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and other nationalities. Not to be overlooked either are the values that were forsaken to assemble and maintain the U.S.-led military coalition, the implications of devastating, perhaps for a generation, the most industrialized and scientifically advanced Arab country, the imposition of new and large and long-term refugee populations demanding assistance greater in scope and complexity than that known in Europe following World War II, the price of neglecting Soviet transformations critical to enduring national and international security, and of course the severe opportunity costs that have been imposed upon the domestic welfare of at least the United States. One is compelled, at least morally, to ask whether a less militant course might not have avoided such extensive loss. But even more troublesome, in my view, was the apparent failure of the president, despite the grave risks known to him, and despite the humanitarian purposes of the United Nations Charter, even to consider the coupling of the economic sanctions with other nonviolent techniques that over time, and if deftly employed, could have assisted or reinforced the sanctions to the point of forcing Iraq's complete and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, calling for the settlement of interstate disputes first, and I quote, by negotiation, enquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements, or other peaceful means. That appears never to have been taken seriously. Additionally, what Dr. Gene Sharp calls the methods of nonviolent action, or political jujitsu at work, so-called domestic methods of social, economic, and political civil resistance and non-cooperation, appear never to have even been contemplated. Indeed, curiously, for an administration that placed an unusual emphasis on respect for law, there does not even appear to have been a genuflection in the direction of what many international lawyers were calling for, namely a strategy of bringing law to bear in all the municipal courts around the world against Iraq for the claims that arose out of Iraqi misdeeds in order to force Iraq's economic hand even more tightly. In other words, rather than view the all necessary means language of Resolution 678 as a license to use force only as a last resort, as it could and should have been according to some of the delegations at the time of the resolution's adoption, President Bush chose to construe it as an unconditional warrant to go to war come January 15, and as not requiring first the exhaustion of all viable nonviolent strategies of persuasion and coercion. Now, it's true, precisely when non-military means have been exhausted and precisely when military means therefore become necessary is a judgment regarding which even reasonable commanders-in-chief can differ. But it seems scarcely an exhaustion of nonviolent options to have had a high ministerial level meeting only once between Aziz and Baker for only 6 hours and subject to the following presidential instructions, and I quote, "No negotiations, no compromises, no attempts at face-saving, and no rewards for aggression." Surely in the face of a major threat to human life and other important values, it is right to expect more. That extra mile, as President Bush called it, which turned out to be, in the Persian Gulf, very short. One can insist, of course, as did British Foreign Secretary Hurd, that it is wrong to negotiate with a burglar. But the analogy is simplistic, and not just, I might add, because it overlooks the common practice of plea bargaining, which aims at conserving energy and resources without sacrificing principle and is endemic to all legal systems everywhere. When the burglar is heavily armed, as Iraq was, and in part because the police chief had been complicit in the process, and especially when the fate of millions are potentially at stake, in a circumstance of